My name is Aline Kiconco. I am a postdoctoral fellow at Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. My research focuses on gender and conflict, particularly the lived experiences of girls and women in both conflict and post-conflict situations of Africa. So one thing that is central in today's societies is knowledge. Knowledge helps us organize the settings we live in and also connect with other parts of the world. But when you look at the knowledge that we rely on to organize our societies and also make decisions on complex issues, you observe that the knowledge is imbalanced. There's knowledge that is prioritized as the right knowledge, the knowledge that we should seek to make decisions to organize our lives and our societies. And then also there are people who are seen as the experts of this knowledge, people who decide which knowledge is right, which knowledge should be ignored, which knowledge should be prioritized. So that causes a problem, an injustice, and a knowledge injustice that people who are engaged in anti-slavery knowledge production should be aware of. One way of achieving knowledge justice is to shift power from storytellers, for example, researchers and organizations, towards the owners of these stories. These are survivors and their communities. The KN project has achieved this in many of their projects. For example, the VIOMEREN project. The project looks at the reintegration experiences of survivors from different parts of the world in Nigeria. The methodology used by VIOMEREN project is powerful because it includes coaching and mentoring early stage local artists to produce artwork on human trafficking. It also facilitates development of collaboration between artists and survivors to articulate short stories and poetry and also paintings. The methodology of pairing local artists and survivors is powerful because it creates disruptive writings and art. Disruptive in a sense that most of the works on human trafficking works towards creating a pity narrative. Message can be communicated in different ways. So we see the VIOMEREN project coming up with the creative and innovative ways of how we could disrupt the pity narrative. The content in this project suggests that developing a horizontal collaboration with survivors to create knowledge builds and centers trust. And also it shows that acknowledging true and ethical stories is about collaboration, closely talking to and learning from each other. This is an important question, a question that I have been grappling with in my research, because working with the survivors of rebel abductions, sexual violence, sexual slavery, it is a sensitive area of study, and you're working with people who have gone through traumatizing experiences for a number of years, and they are in settings where sometimes they are unable to access support to help them, recover from these experiences. So how do you go about, engaging them, asking them about their past, about their experiences? I wouldn't call them their past experiences because they still relive those experiences. They still, experience some form of injustice because their communities use their past to stigmatize them, to marginalize them. So these women are unable to sort of step away from their past. So how do you go on to ask them to talk about their lived experiences? Many a times we rely on local experts, we rely on NGOs, we rely on political figures or sometimes local leaders for you to be able to break through in the community to access the survivors. But all that, it has an impact on how the survivor will receive you at the end of the day. You as a researcher, you come with your own powers, the class, the race, the privileges that you may have. So you have to think through access. So you have to be creative. You have to think through, for every survivor, you have to think through all the different challenges that may arise as a result of you walking into their compound and asking, for their name and involvement in your project. Questions of safeguarding and ethics were paramount for the AKN project. For example, in Sierra Leone, the AKN sponsored the creation of a number of films that were produced by We Own TV. These included kid miners and seaside and borderline communities. Now, from the films, we learn that there are different levels of negotiation that should be done. That starts from community leaders, family members, before we get to the actual actors to participate in the film. We see that in the seaside and borderline communities, the main character is a young woman who migrated from the rural areas and then traveled to the city. And because of the challenges of living in the city, they had to end up in the sex work industry. So there is another layer of guardians that the film producers had to negotiate with. So in these films, we get to learn that creating films with survivors needs to be adapted in culturally and experientially sensitive ways in order to keep the participants safe and the films on ethically solid ground. Of course, this takes experience. In these films, one thing that is worth noting is that the producers were locals. They were born, they have grown up in Sierra Leone. Some of them have lived in some of these communities, similar communities. So they know how to maneuver the politics, who to approach first. How do you go about talking to a male chief? How do you go about talking to a female chief? So I think this is what made this film, these two films outstanding, in that the local experts were the forefront of producing these stories. Now, an injustice is basically a wrongful use of power. So power is something that we have to be cautious about. How much power do you hold? How do you go about reducing that power? Because you as a researcher and the survivor, they will always have power imbalances. The partnerships that we have, that we are part of as researchers or as people collecting information, historically we've seen them as, having power imbalances. So how do we go on disrupting these power imbalances? The AKN project has relied on different methods, and I think that is one way we can go about disrupting the power imbalances. We have to come up with methods that are empowering the participants. I use interviews. I have seen how the interviews are limiting. You put a person in a room, that is already formalizing the whole engagement. It is an official engagement for this survivor. So how do you go on, disrupting that formality? By being creative, by coming up with different ways of collecting information. Survivors' Voices is a collection of 15 stories and photographs created by real survivors of exploitation in Kenya. A multinational and disciplinary research team worked with these survivors to compile their stories. They worked with survivors on how to go about creating their stories, what they wanted to tell. And although they were working with storytelling experts and photograph experts, the survivors were given the opportunity to come up with the versions of the stories they wanted to tell. The methodology of encouraging survivors to tell their stories in their own voices, in their own spaces, and in their own timing, positioned and represented the survivors as knowers of their experiences, of their past, and of their world, making them collaborators and co-creators of knowledge in this project. The stories in this collection are at times graphic in nature. Many times researchers grapple with the questions of how do we ask survivors to tell stories that are horrific. So there is an attempt in the book for survivors to tell stories in their entirety, that is giving details before exploitation, during exploitation, and after exploitation. The message is that experiences of trauma are part of a larger picture. So we see that the stories and photographs in this collection reveal things about survivors' personal lives, before exploitation and during and after exploitation, how they worked with their families, how they ended up in the relationships of exploitation, their communities, and also they project their future. What is clear from these stories that the survivors, when they are given space, when they are encouraged to tell their stories, we get nuanced stories that sometimes are not produced in different methodologies.